Dear curious listener, you've just woken up in the year 1864. The room is quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after a well-funded funeral. Your husband is gone. So is your social life. What remains is you. A black dress, a cold room, and the faint clinking of teacups downstairs. Your name might be Agnes or Eleanor. Doesn't really matter. You wear crepe now. You walk softly, and you cry discreetly, because loud grief is unladylike. You're not just mourning, you're performing. Every ribbon, every sigh, every properly downcast gaze is part of the show. But don't worry, you're safe here. You don't have to curtsy or clutch a lace handkerchief. You can just lie back, close your eyes, and let the past wash over you like a stiff veil and a mountain of social expectation. And if you enjoy drifting into misery like this, go ahead, subscribe, and tell me what country you're watching from. Welcome to Widowhood. It's exhausting. So, it's the morning after the funeral, and you, lucky you, are now officially a Victorian widow. You've crossed the threshold from wife to walking symbol of loss, and society expects you to behave accordingly, which is to say, no smiling, no color, and under absolutely no circumstances are you allowed to enjoy your breakfast. The house is quiet, too quiet, not peaceful, just performatively still. The mirror in your room has been covered in black crepe. Mirrors must be draped after a death to prevent the soul of the deceased from becoming trapped, or worse, to prevent you from accidentally catching your own reflection and realizing how exhausted you already look. All the clocks in the house have been stopped at the hour of death, because grief, apparently, needs a time stamp. The air smells of lilies, wood polish, and old wax, the scent of mourning. Everything has been tidied for appearances. Everything except you. Today is not about recovery. It's not even about grief. It's about etiquette. There is no period of rest after the funeral. No quiet day of reflection. What happens instead is the immediate transition into mourning protocol. A protocol you're expected to follow to the letter, or else risk becoming the subject of church whisperers and parish gossip. Your mourning period begins with what's known as deep mourning. This phase lasts approximately 3 months, and it is the most socially restrictive period a woman can experience. You're expected to wear unrelieved black, not stylish black, not velvet or satin. You'll wear crepe, a dull, scratchy silk so unfriendly it practically communicates your sorrow on its own. The fabric is matte on purpose. Shiny material is too cheerful. Patterns are forbidden. Lace is out of the question. The dress must say, "I am devastated," and also, "I am not here for your attention." And yet everyone will be looking. Don't worry, it gets worse. If your late husband had money, you'll be expected to mourn him publicly for at least 2 full years. That's 24 months of colorless clothing, whispered conversations, and being seated at the boring end of the dinner table. If he didn't have money, you'll be expected to mourn him while also figuring out how not to starve. Either way, you'll be very busy doing nothing at all. Now you may be wondering, what if you don't feel like mourning? What if your husband was dull, controlling, or, God forbid, a man with opinions about your stitching technique? Irrelevant. Victorian mourning isn't about feelings, it's about optics. If you don't follow the rules, people will talk. If you do follow the rules, they'll still talk, just slightly less. You are now a symbol, and symbols aren't allowed to have agency. Socially, you are a ghost. You are not to attend parties, visit friends, or be seen engaging in anything resembling pleasure. You may attend church, but only if you appear appropriately hollowed out by sorrow. Receiving visitors is discouraged. Leaving the house for errands is frowned upon. If you need to buy anything, you'll likely send someone else, preferably someone with less visible tragedy clinging to their shawl. Your household will treat you with exaggerated delicacy. The servants will lower their voices around you. The maid may avert her eyes as she brings you your breakfast. The butler may speak in half sentences, unsure whether good morning still applies to someone recently bereaved. Downstairs, your tea is being prepared. Weak tea, of course. No sugar unless medically necessary. Widows are not supposed to indulge. Appetite suggests stability, and stability implies recovery. You're not recovering. You're mourning. And Victorian society does not allow you to grieve quietly or privately. It expects you to grieve correctly. Later today, condolence letters will arrive, some with genuine sympathy, others stuffed with subtle questions about the estate, the property, or your future plans. You're not supposed to reply immediately, but you are supposed to keep them. Proper mourning requires documentation. Nothing in your room can be out of place. Not the slippers by the bed, not the comb on your dresser, not the black-bordered handkerchief laid neatly on the table. Your surroundings must reflect your emotional state, controlled, orderly, bleak. And as you sit on the edge of your bed, looking at the stiff crepe dress draped over the chair, your new daily uniform, you realize something important. This isn't just sadness, it's a full-time occupation. Being a widow means becoming a symbol of devotion, of decency, of public virtue. And whether you feel it or not, the mourning has begun. So now that you're a widow, you may be wondering, how long are you expected to live like this? Well, the answer depends entirely on who died, your social class, and most importantly, your gender. In the Victorian era, mourning wasn't just an emotional process. It was a public performance, and women were its lead actresses. Men could appear sorrowful, maybe wear a black armband for a few weeks, sigh in the right direction, and return to their gentleman's club by month's end. But you're expected to vanish. If it was your husband who died, the proper mourning period is a minimum of 2 years. Not suggested, expected. For a parent or child, you're looking at about 1 year, a sibling, 6 months, a first cousin, 4 weeks, and a second cousin twice removed. Well, that one's a judgment call, but don't you dare show up to tea in color too soon. Someone's aunt is watching. And yes, there are etiquette books that spell this out, with charts. Charts that help you decide how many months of sadness are appropriate for a great aunt versus an in-law. Because in Victorian society, grief isn't something you feel. It's something you wear, something you schedule. And, this is important, it was women who bore the brunt of this cultural obligation. While men could grieve with a stiff upper lip and a fresh shave, you were expected to transform into a human shrine. Your wardrobe became a message board. Every shade of black, every length of veil, every absence of jewelry, it all meant something. The absence of color said, I am still mourning. The absence of lace, still taking it seriously. The absence of your presence at parties, as it should be. You couldn't simply say you were grieving. You had to prove it every day with how you dressed, how you walked, how you folded your hands in your lap. Even your facial expression was regulated. Too cheery, you're heartless. Too hollow, you're being dramatic. There's a very thin line between respectable grief and social embarrassment. And somehow, you're supposed to walk it, in crepe, without tripping. And let's talk about that crepe again, shall we? Crepe was the official mourning fabric because it was deliberately unpleasant. It faded fast, it frayed easily, it refused to hold shape, which, conveniently, made it the perfect metaphor for the state of your life. But wearing it was non-negotiable. No shiny buttons, no colored ribbons, no cheerful silks, just layers of dull black misery. And you couldn't just own one mourning dress. Oh no. There were walking dresses, visiting dresses, evening mourning, even mourning bonnets, each for a specific occasion you probably weren't allowed to attend. Why? Because your grief wasn't just yours. It had to be recognizable to others. Mourning was a visual cue, a way to let everyone else know they should pity you, but also admire how well you're holding it together. And yes, widows were praised for bearing sorrow with dignity, which usually meant suffering silently while looking appropriately gray and fragile. There were no exceptions to this obligation unless you were poor enough to be ignored or rich enough to quietly rebel. Most women weren't either. So they borrowed mourning clothes from friends or dyed existing garments black with unreliable homemade dye. Some even burned their old clothes in desperation, hoping the ashes would signal grief better than last season's fashion. Even mourning behavior had rules. You were not to laugh. You were not to sing. You were not to appear in public except under very specific, joyless circumstances. The entire point was to demonstrate restraint. Emotional, social, and aesthetic restraint. You could be drowning in sorrow, or you could feel nothing at all. Didn't matter. As long as your dress was dark enough, your jewelry minimal enough, and your posture sufficiently wilted, you passed the test. So now, as you sit in your parlor with the curtains half drawn, drinking weak tea and listening to the muffled sound of life continuing elsewhere, you begin to understand. This isn't healing. This is theater. And the audience? They're watching to see if you get the costume right. Now that you're officially in mourning, it's time to review the schedule. Yes, a schedule. Because in Victorian England, grief doesn't unfold naturally. It follows a prescribed sequence, complete with dress codes, behavior standards, and, naturally, neighborhood supervision. Welcome to the 3 stages of mourning: deep mourning, full mourning, and half mourning. Like a gloomy staircase, each level brings you slightly closer to normal life, though not too fast. Wouldn't want anyone thinking you've bounced back too quickly. That would be indecent. Let's begin with deep mourning, also called first mourning, or as you'll come to know it, the cloistered crepe era. This phase lasts a minimum of 3 months, but commonly stretches to 6 or more, depending on how highly society ranked the deceased, or how closely your neighbors monitor your grief. During deep mourning, you are expected to live in near total withdrawal from society. No public outings, no visitors, unless they're family, no music, no color, and absolutely no laughter, unless you're quoting scripture, and even then, only if it's depressing. Your clothing must be entirely black. That includes undergarments, gloves, handkerchiefs, and even the lining of your bonnet. The fabric should still be crepe, of course. Always crepe. Because soft, wearable fabric might suggest comfort, and comfort might suggest you're no longer suffering properly. Hair must be worn tucked up, simple, neat, and absolutely unadorned. You may not wear jewelry unless it contains the hair of the deceased or is made from jet, a dull black fossilized material specifically chosen for its funereal charm. If you previously wore a wedding ring, you might now switch to a mourning ring, engraved with his initials, just in case anyone doubts whose grief you're performing. And here's the truly charming part. During deep mourning, you're not supposed to even appear in public. Not really. If you must go out, it should be for something tragic, like arranging a headstone. Otherwise, your house becomes your theater, and you are the show. Visitors who drop by for condolence visits won't expect conversation. Just tea, polite sadness, and the visual satisfaction of knowing you still look appropriately miserable. Then, if you've met expectations and haven't scandalized anyone by appearing slightly alive, you're permitted to graduate to full mourning. This phase is slightly more flexible. You may switch from crepe to bombazine, a heavier, more dignified black silk wool blend that says, "I am still bereaved, but now I have upholstery." You're also allowed to speak in a slightly more animated tone. Not cheerful, just audible. Gloves may now have subtle embellishments. Jewelry, while still limited, might include lockets or brooches containing tiny portraits. Or again, hair. So much hair. Victorian mourning culture really did enjoy collecting hair. You're allowed to walk in the park now, provided you don't sit too long or smile at any ducks. This phase lasts another 3 to 6 months, possibly longer if you're from a respectable family, or your sister-in-law keeps dropping pointed remarks about those who rush their grief. And finally, you reach half mourning, the light at the end of the tunnel, or at least the part of the tunnel where you're allowed to wear lavender. Yes, you heard correctly. Lavender, gray, mauve, even pale lilac, these colors become acceptable during half mourning. They signal that you are still grieving, but not aggressively. You are open to society, but not to joy. You may attend select events, like tea with older relatives, or musical evenings, as long as you don't hum along. In half mourning, your veil is shortened. Your accessories expand slightly, and your posture may once again resemble that of a living person. But here's the catch. Everyone is watching you, especially other women, especially other widows. Did you return to society too soon? Were your gloves too decorative? Was your laugh a bit too real? The mourning period may be defined in months, but the judgment lasts for years. Because in Victorian England, mourning wasn't just about sorrow. It was a moral performance, measured not in tears, but in compliance. You were expected to grieve not how you felt, but how others required you to. And in this system, the worst thing you could do wasn't grieving badly. It was grieving wrong. By now you've realized that being a Victorian widow isn't just a social role, it's practically a costume department. Because in the 19th century, mourning was worn, quite literally, and not just in a symbolic way. Your grief had sleeves, it had buttons, it had a waistband that still required a corset, because apparently suffering was no excuse for bad posture. Let's start with the dress. It's black, of course, but not just any black, not elegant, not flattering, and certainly not satin. You're issued crepe, the official fabric of sorrow. The texture is deliberate. It must never shimmer or catch the light, because that might imply hope. And it's not just one dress. You'll need several. A walking dress, a home dress, a dress for receiving guests you're not allowed to see. Each one nearly identical. Long sleeves, high collar, stiff silhouette. Because comfort, like color, is inappropriate. Now let's add the veil, the infamous weeping veil. This isn't some soft, gossamer thing that flows gently in the wind. No, this veil is long, heavy, and thick enough to obscure your face entirely. It's worn over a black bonnet and often reaches past your waist. The idea, of course, is modesty, But it also makes eating, breathing, and navigating staircases uniquely dangerous. You are not to remove it in public. If you happen to trip over a cobblestone while half blinded by your own sorrow curtain, do so gracefully. The veil stays on. Even your underclothes must be black. Corset, chemise, petticoat, all of it. Because God forbid your inner layers contain joy, or worse, pastel. Stockings? Black. Gloves? Black. Handkerchiefs? Yes, those too. Even your fan, if you're allowed one, must be black lace or jet. And if you think you can accessorize your way out of this, let's talk about mourning jewelry. In the Victorian era, mourning jewelry became its own industry. Lockets containing a photograph or a lock of hair from the deceased were common. More elaborate pieces included brooches woven from human hair, often styled into delicate flowers or braided into intricate patterns. Some widows even wore rings embedded with teeth, though thankfully this was less fashionable than it sounds. You may find this disturbing, but in Victorian society, it was considered deeply sentimental. Death wasn't supposed to be hidden. It was supposed to be honored, worn. A woman wearing her husband's hair pinned to her chest was considered dignified. A woman wearing pearls? Brazen. And who do we thank for this nationwide embrace of funereal fashion? That would be Queen Victoria. After the death of Prince Albert in 1861, Queen Victoria entered a mourning period that lasted 40 years. She wore black every day for the rest of her life. Her example turned mourning into not just a personal rite, but a national aesthetic. And when the Queen mourns, the empire follows. Soon, mourning dress wasn't just expected, it was commercialized. Shops began offering entire mourning departments. Fashion plates were printed. Catalogs were mailed out featuring tasteful widow ensembles. There were magazines that advised on seasonal trends in grief wear. As if to say, you may have lost your husband, but that's no excuse for being out of style. But here's the twist. As mourning fashion became more formalized, it also became a trap. Because once grief is measured in garments, you are no longer judged by how you feel, only by how you look. If your veil is too short, you're careless. If your dress is too expensive, you're vain. If you repeat an outfit, tasteless. If you wear anything remotely flattering, scandalous. And the longer your wardrobe remains black, the harder it becomes to return to color. Not just socially, but emotionally. Because one day, months from now, you'll reach for a lavender ribbon and pause. You'll wonder who will notice, who will whisper, who will assume you're moving on too quickly. And in that moment, you'll realize that the grief wasn't just stitched into your hem. It was stitched into you. Your house is still here, of course. Every floorboard, every door hinge, every familiar crack in the wallpaper. But without him, it doesn't feel like home anymore. It feels like a museum, one that smells faintly of lilies, floor polish, and unspoken disapproval. Gone are the casual footsteps, the pipe smoke curling through the air, the soft rustle of a newspaper being folded in the next room. Now there's just silence. Not peace, silence. A strained, fragile quiet that seems to warn, don't break anything, not the tea set, not the mood, not even your composure. Your drawing room is pristine. Too pristine. It used to host laughter, music, the occasional argument about whether celery belonged in aspic. Now, no one dares sit on the settee without permission. The piano remains closed. And that amusing little painting above the hearth, the one he hated, suddenly feels like an act of treason. You walk through the rooms like a guest in your own life, not because the furniture's changed, because you have, or rather, because everyone else thinks you should. The servants, who once greeted you with easy familiarity, now walk like they're afraid of creaking the floor. The housemaid lowers her eyes when she dusts. The butler clears his throat in the hallway, then decides not to speak at all. And the cook? She's started sending up gruel, not because you requested it, just because it seems more appropriate now. In this house, grief has manners, and so must you. You maintain order, not because it helps, but because letting go would be far too alarming for everyone else. The table must still be set at the usual time. The linens must be ironed, the pantry inventoried, because heaven forbid your mourning affect the daily routine. And while we're on the topic, no, you cannot rearrange the furniture. That's far too cheerful. In fact, changing the placement of anything, so much as shifting a vase, might suggest you're refreshing the space, which would hint at emotional progress, which is absolutely unacceptable in the early months of widowhood. You're not meant to move on. You're meant to preserve. The house must remain a shrine to him, to the marriage, to the you that used to be. Even writing a letter in a different chair might raise eyebrows. Oh, she's sitting near the window now? How very optimistic. In truth, your home is now less of a sanctuary and more of a stage set. Everything must signal solemnity. The curtains stay drawn, not fully, just enough to let in a respectable gloom. The flowers, if any, are white. The tablecloth, ironed and dark. No one really explained why grief had to match the upholstery, but somehow it does. And while you're busy keeping the house in its respectable state of despair, let's acknowledge the one being who hasn't altered their behavior in the slightest. Your cat. She still jumps on your lap when you sit. She still scratches the furniture when you aren't looking. She still expects dinner at precisely the same time and will yowl dramatically if it's even a minute late. To her, you're not a widow. You're the same person you were yesterday, just slower moving and covered in more fabric. In some strange way, she's the only creature in the house treating you normally. Because while the rest of society has decided you are now a solemn artifact, some delicate relic of sorrow, your cat just sees a warm lap and a consistent meal provider. And that's comforting. Or at least, it's familiar. So you carry on, adjusting the doilies, dusting the picture frames, folding the napkins with deliberate care. Not because you want to, not even because it helps, but because grief in a Victorian household must be neat, tidy, and utterly predictable. You are no longer just the lady of the house. You are the mourner-in-chief, the keeper of quiet rooms, the guardian of appropriate sadness. And for now, at least, this echoing, over-furnished house isn't your refuge. It's your responsibility. You wake early, not out of ambition, not out of energy, just out of habit. The kind of habit that clings to the bones. You used to rise early because he did, because the fire needed tending, because the world expected functionality by breakfast. Now, you rise because the alternative is lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and wondering whether anyone would notice if you simply didn't come down for tea. The house is cold. Of course it is. Grief doesn't come with central heating. You slip your feet into the same slippers you've worn every morning for years. They're worn thin at the toes, but still considered acceptable morning attire. Because even your footwear is being judged. Downstairs, the maid has left your breakfast in the drawing room, a slice of dry toast, one pat of butter, carefully rationed, and tea, thin, pale, and somehow both hot and uninspiring. The sugar bowl is conspicuously absent. You'd ask for it, but it feels inappropriate now. Sweetness doesn't quite suit the tone of things, You sit alone, always alone, because breakfast is no longer a shared event. It's an obligation. The ticking clock reminds you to chew. The cat flicks her tail and stares, unimpressed from the windowsill. You sip your tea and try not to think about how this used to be the best part of the day. The newspaper arrives, carefully ironed, of course. Wrinkle-free grief only, thank you. You unfold it mechanically, eyes scanning headlines you don't care about. A shipment of cotton delayed, a new lecture series on moral virtue, a fire in a warehouse no one will remember next week. Then you reach the society column, and your eyes pause, because even if you're not invited anywhere, your name can still appear. And today, it does. Right there, between a charity ball and an engagement announcement, Mrs. A continues to observe her mourning with admirable decorum. No visitors received. A polite way of saying, still not wearing lilac, still no new suitors, still properly sad. You fold the paper slowly, carefully, not out of interest, out of survival, because even the smallest social mention reminds you that the world is watching your grief, measuring it, logging it against lace choices and bonnet ribbons. On the side table, there's a small stack of letters. You already know what they say. The first one is from a married friend. It begins predictably, "My dearest, I hope you are bearing up," which is Victorian for, "How long do you intend to stay single?" The second includes an invitation to tea, clearly meant to lift your spirits, but hosted by a woman who once called your curtains common. Hard pass. The third is from your cousin, who is recently married and wants to remind you how wonderful her new husband is. She signs off with, "Time heals all wounds." You make a note to write back never. You don't receive visitors. That much is true. Not because you're antisocial, but because no one knows how to visit a widow. Do they bring flowers? Avoid talking about husbands. Speak only in hushed tones. The etiquette is confusing, so most people simply write vague letters and wait to see if you'll emerge. You won't. Not yet. The rules still say you shouldn't. So instead you clear your plate, even though you weren't hungry, and stack the dishes neatly for the maid. You refold the newspaper. You straighten the chair cushion that doesn't need straightening. You give the cat a half-hearted scratch behind the ear. And then, like every other morning, you begin the slow walk to the next room. Not because there's something urgent to do, but because you need to fill the hours with something. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough to feel the full weight of the silence. This is your new morning routine. It isn't tragic. It isn't dramatic. It's just quiet, not peaceful. Just the sort of quiet that leaves space for your thoughts to echo too loudly. And tomorrow, it'll look exactly the same. You never thought the mail could feel threatening, and yet here you are, staring at a fresh pile of envelopes, trying to guess which ones are laced with polite cruelty and which are just plain nosy. Because in widowhood, even letters become emotional landmines. Your correspondence now comes from three main factions: cousins you haven't seen in years, in-laws who weren't this interested when your husband was alive, and married friends whose tone is somewhere between sympathetic and smug. The opening lines are always soft. "I hope this note finds you well. We were all so terribly shocked. You've been in my thoughts daily." But then the tone shifts, subtly, painfully. "Have you given any thought to what you'll do next?" Translation: Are you staying in the house? Or should we start circling like vultures? I do hope you're able to find peace. Translation: Please grieve quietly and don't do anything embarrassing. like enjoy yourself. And the best one, you're such a strong, independent woman, which in Victorian code means you're probably never marrying again, are you? Because independent, while flattering in theory, was often shorthand for economically inconvenient and socially surplus. To be a woman on her own was not a declaration of confidence. It was a gentle way of saying, "Oh, she's still here." Some letters come with thinly veiled inquiries about the estate, whether the house will be sold, whether you've considered downsizing, whether that lovely set of dining chairs is still in the family. I only ask because they'd suit our drawing room so well. It's astonishing how quickly condolence turns into inventory. You learn to read between the lines with near professional precision. A single underlined word, passive aggression, too many exclamation marks, social panic, a PS with a vague offer to help. Definitely code for, "Please let me in on your husband's will." Even well-meaning letters sting. They ask about your health, your spirits, your intentions, questions you're not allowed to ask in return. You can't write back and say, "How's your marriage holding up now that your husband's taking lunch with the governess?" No, you're a widow now. You're above that. So instead, you respond the only way you can, with polite, artful deflection. You keep your handwriting even, your tone gracious. You thank them for their concern. You say vague things like, taking each day as it comes, and leaning on fond memories. You never admit that some days you want to throw every letter into the fireplace and live in stubborn silence. But eventually, you do write back. Not because you want to, but because if you don't, someone will say you've become too cold, or bitter, or strange. So you sit at your writing desk, posture straight, veil lifted, and begin. You choose the good paper, the proper pen. You draft and redraft, because one wrong sentence might echo back to you at a garden party 3 years from now. You craft your responses with practiced wit and emotional distance. A sentence like, "I've taken comfort in routine," really means, "I'm keeping busy so I don't scream." You refer to the future as uncertain, which is Victorian shorthand for, "Stop asking if I'm planning to remarry." You thank them for their prayers. You do not ask for their opinions. You sign off with something neutral and respectable. Yours most sincerely, because warmly would be too modern, and with love would invite rumors. Then you place the letter in its envelope, seal it with wax, and set it gently on the pile for the footman to collect. It's a performance, of course, like everything else now, but it's a controlled one. You may not get to choose what people say about you, but you do get to write the version they'll repeat. And for today, that's something. The will has been read. The black dress has been worn. The letters of condolence have dwindled to silence. And now comes the part no one likes to talk about. Money. Specifically, his money. Because let's be clear, no matter how long you were married, no matter how many dinners you hosted or children you bore, the estate wasn't yours. It was his. The money was his. Even the teaspoons were his, engraved with his family crest, passed down through his bloodline. And now that he's gone, well, you may be left with nothing more than his ring, his debts, and the pressure to carry on with dignity. If you were lucky, the will included a modest allowance for your upkeep, enough to cover coal, bread, and the daily performance of sadness. But if not, if the estate passed directly to a male heir, or the debts outweighed the assets, congratulations. You are now an unpaid actress in the longest-running play society has ever staged. the gracious, invisible widow. Your options are few, and none of them are glamorous. You could, of course, remarry. That's the most respectable path. But here's the catch. Remarrying too soon is scandalous. People will whisper. They'll question how deeply you grieved. They'll say you must have had him replaced before he was cold. But if you wait too long, well, that's another kind of problem. Because after a certain age, a woman alone becomes something of a logistical burden. She is no longer romantically viable. She is not young enough to be decorative, nor old enough to be pitied. She is simply in the way. And still, somehow, you're told to be grateful. Grateful that your late husband left anything at all. Grateful that the neighbors still acknowledge you. Grateful that you don't have to scrub floors or knit socks for rent, yet. But what if you're not the remarriage type? What then? There's the boarding house option. Take in a few respectable lodgers, perhaps a traveling clergyman or a quiet spinster cousin. Turn your once private home into a polite, whisper-filled inn. You'll lose your peace, your reputation, and possibly your good silver. But you might, just might, keep the roof over your head. Or perhaps you lean into women's work. You could take up embroidery, endless, wrist-gnawing embroidery, needlepoint cushions for other people's drawing rooms, samplers for wealthier women to pretend they stitch themselves. It pays pennies, but it pays. If you were educated, and that's a dangerous assumption, you might consider teaching. Not in a real school, of course. That would be unseemly. No, you'd tutor the daughters of second-rate gentry in French pronunciation and Bible recitation for 10 hours a day, for 10 shillings a week. And even then, you're not truly independent. You're just hanging on by your fingertips, praying no one notices the frayed cuffs on your only wearable dress. Because once you're poor and a widow, the world stops treating you like a tragic heroine and starts treating you like a problem. The invitations vanish, the friends dry up. You are no longer the mysterious woman in black. You are simply a reminder, uncomfortably close, that anyone can fall from grace. But let's say you do remarry. You survive the mourning period. You endure the side glances. You find a man, perhaps older, perhaps not particularly interesting, but available. He proposes. You accept. People nod approvingly over their tea. And just like that, your late husband's entire legacy is folded away like a winter coat. You take off your widow's veil. You become Mrs. New Surname. And everything about your first life becomes a footnote. You aren't the widow anymore. You're a second wife, a new bride, expected to smile, to host, to begin again, as if none of it ever happened. And if that sounds jarring, it's because it is. The truth is, no matter what choice you make, remarry, take in lodgers, sew until your hands cramp, you are still playing a role someone else wrote. You are still operating inside a system that was not built for your survival, only your obedience. And when people say, "She handled it all with such grace," what they really mean is, "She didn't make us uncomfortable." So you weigh your choices. Ruined or remarried, invisible or inconvenient, embroidering your soul into handkerchiefs, or smiling at a stranger across a supper table, wondering if he snores. And through it all, you keep your back straight. Because even in poverty, even in uncertainty, a proper widow must never slouch. You are no longer a wife, but you're not a maiden either. You don't belong to anyone now. No husband, no father, no guardian. And in Victorian society, that makes you unsettling, not tragic, not dignified, unsettling. Because a woman without a man isn't simply alone. She's unsupervised. And you, dear widow, have officially become a social question mark. Young women avoid you. They lower their voices when you enter a room. They shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you've done something unrepeatable. You've lived with a man. You've shared a bed. And now you walk around with all that experience, and no one to contain it. Worse still, you don't cry as often as you used to, which means one of two things. Either you're healing, which is alarming, or you were never properly devastated to begin with, which is worse. And so the whispers begin. Widows are said to have appetite. Not the tea and biscuits kind, the other kind. No one says it outright, of course. That would be indecent. Instead, it's said with raised eyebrows and lowered voices, with phrases like, "She seemed forward," or "She still wears rouge, you know." If you smile too often, you're desperate. If you're too somber, you're bitter. If you attend church regularly, you're clinging. If you miss a service, you're drifting. In every room, your reputation arrives 5 minutes before you do. You are too visible to be ignored, and too unmoored to be trusted. The older men at dinner parties, they watch you, not openly, just enough for you to notice, and just enough for their wives to also notice. You become a sort of social Rorschach test. Some see you as pitiable, others as presumptuous, some as a threat. You're the woman who might accidentally attract someone else's husband, not because you want to, but because you could. You're the woman who might wear too much lace, or laugh too loudly, or request a second helping of pudding, because now everything you do is weighed against this invisible scale of appropriateness, and the scale is never balanced in your favor. Widows are supposed to be quiet, but not gloomy. Presentable, but not decorated. Sociable, but never flirtatious. Attractive, but only in a vaguely tragic way. It's a role you didn't audition for, and one you can never quite get right. Some women lean into it. They become professional mourners. They speak only of their husbands. They wear black until the day they die, even after society has forgotten why. These women are respected, feared a little, but respected. Others try to reclaim a sliver of self, a brighter bonnet, a smile at a shopkeeper, maybe even a scandalous thought, a holiday by the sea. These women are observed, then discussed, then quietly distanced, because being a widow isn't just about loss, it's about optics. It's about walking the tightrope between virtue and vulnerability, decorum and desire. Too much of either, and you're out of balance. So, you learn the routine. You speak carefully. You write thank you notes promptly. You never laugh too hard or sit too long next to anyone's husband. You live within the boundaries of a reputation you never asked for, but are now expected to uphold. Because in the eyes of society, you're no longer simply a woman. You're a widow, and that makes you something between a relic and a rumor. You didn't plan to go, but the invitation arrived, pressed, folded, and worded with just enough politeness to be unrefusable. A quiet gathering, mid-afternoon, proper company, all widows, no men. You show up, not knowing what to expect. Perhaps a solemn circle of tea drinkers, nodding politely while discussing grave plots. Perhaps something worse, silent competition for who is grieving best. But instead, you find something strange, something unexpected. A room of women who are completely unshocked by your existence. The tea is strong, stronger than it needs to be for a respectable gathering. But no one complains. Because after months or years of tepid sympathy and whispered judgment, this room is warm in all the right ways. You're offered a chair near the fire. A saucer is pressed into your hand. And then come the stories. They start cautiously. Hushed tones, soft chuckles. But it doesn't take long before the conversation unfurls like a bolt of black crepe dropped from a great height. One widow shares the tale of how her husband accidentally fell asleep with a full pipe. Twice. Another admits she once fantasized about poisoning the soup. Not seriously, of course, just imaginatively. They all nod. They all understand. And then someone, the blunt one in the corner with the embroidered cuffs, says flatly, "Honestly, the only thing I miss is having someone to blame for the draft in the parlor." Laughter bubbles up, brief, sharp, defiant. No one lingers on sorrow here, not because they don't feel it. Oh, they do. But because this room, this hour, this pot of tea, it's the only place where grief is allowed to be complicated. You glance around the room. The youngest widow sits stiffly by the window. She still wears her veil. It droops across her lap like a wet curtain, and her eyes dart between everyone's faces, unsure of whether to laugh or stay composed. She is mourning with textbook precision, but she's listening, and that's how it begins. The oldest widow is dressed entirely in black, right down to her shoes. You're not sure she's ever worn another color. She drinks her tea without cream, without sugar, without blinking, and when she speaks, it's with the dry wit of someone who has outlasted expectations and enjoys it. Next to you, someone is embroidering. Not a sampler, not a scripture verse, a napkin with the phrase, "Not today, Cupid." The letters are tiny, sharp, vengeful. She offers a sly smile when she notices you reading it. "Therapy," she says, "comes in stitches." You sip your tea and realize it's the first time you've smiled in public without feeling guilty. No one here expects you to explain your grief or dress it up in language acceptable to clergymen and gossip columns. No one minds if your hem is slightly crooked. No one will judge if you take a second scone. They've all been where you are, that uncertain space between reverence and resentment. They've all worn the veil, written the thank you notes, smiled at the wrong man, and paid the price in whispers. Here, the rules relax, not vanish. This is still Victorian society after all, but bend, just enough to let some air in. The conversation turns eventually to the practical. What to do with all the black dresses when mourning is over. How to discreetly sell a silver tea set. Whether anyone knows a good boarding house that doesn't smell like boiled cabbage. It's mundane. It's honest. It's freedom in miniature. And when the clock strikes the hour, the teacups are gathered. The veils adjusted. The shoes tied. Everyone resumes their positions in the world outside. But as you leave, you realize something. You are not the only woman walking this strange, narrow line between memory and reinvention. And for a brief hour, over strong tea and stronger sarcasm, you were not just a widow. You were understood. There are only so many things a widow can do with her time. Crying in the drawing room isn't sustainable. Neither is staring meaningfully out of windows while clutching lace handkerchiefs. Eventually, even grief requires a hobby. And so, you pick up a needle. Because in the hierarchy of respectable mourning activities, embroidery reigns supreme. Not too loud, not too physical, just quiet, repetitive motion. Perfect for a woman in black who must appear occupied, but not distracted. You stitch, not out of joy, but out of obligation. A widow without needlework is like a soldier without boots, unprepared and suspicious. Your first project is a sampler, a safe choice. Cross-stitched alphabets, maybe a Bible verse. Something about patience or sorrow, something everyone can agree on. But soon, the pillowcases arrive, the tablecloths, the handkerchiefs with initials of people who never write back. And eventually, when your fingers ache and your eyes blur, the needle becomes a means of protest. You begin to sneak in messages, tiny ones, hidden along the hems and tucked beneath polite scrollwork. Bury me with the wine. Not today, society. Patience is overrated. They're not visible to anyone else, but you know they're there, and that's enough. Embroidery becomes your scripted rebellion, a way to speak when no one will let you raise your voice. Around you, other widows do the same. You meet weekly for sewing circles, which sound pious and respectable, because they are. Mostly. The chairs are arranged just so. Tea is served, weak and without cream, mourning after all. And the thimbles click like little metronomes of containment. But beneath the surface, it's far less innocent. Gossip travels by thread. As your needle passes through cloth, so too does information pass through whispers. Did you hear about Mrs. Ellington? Already wearing half mourning. They say the new curate has been seen walking Miss Lacey home. Apparently, the solicitor's wife has a rather expensive taste in gloves. You don't contribute much at first, just polite nods and carefully neutral expressions. But eventually, you're drawn in. Because in this world, needlework is not just a pastime, it's a survival mechanism. It keeps your hands busy. It keeps your mind from drifting to places too sharp, too loud, too real. And more than that, it signals your adherence to the rules. Proper women stitch. Improper women fidget. Your stitches become your proof. You are coping. You are composed. You are doing exactly what's expected, even if the fabric beneath your hands is embroidered with passive-aggressive Latin phrases. Sometimes, the youngest widow fumbles her thread. She curses under her breath, softly but audibly, and someone inevitably says, "language," while smiling just enough to make it a joke. Because even in grief, decorum must be upheld. Other times, the conversation turns silent. Just the soft sound of thread sliding through linen, the quiet hum of shared monotony. A communion not of faith, but of mutual exhaustion. And in that silence you realize, this is less about art and more about control. In a world where everything has shifted, your needle obeys. It pierces where you guide it. It knots where you tell it to. It gives form to chaos, one square inch at a time. You don't need a man to stitch a perfect border. You don't need permission to embroider sarcasm into a tea towel. Here, in the quiet, under the guise of domestic duty, you reclaim something. Not freedom, exactly, but something close enough to keep going. There's no ceremony for it, no official announcement, no gentle hand on your shoulder saying, "You may now be slightly less devastated." But the calendar flips, the crepe stiffens, the black dye fades, whether you want it to or not. And one day you stand before the mirror and realize it's time. Half mourning, not quite grief, not quite life, just a carefully approved limbo. You lay the black aside, not entirely, of course. You swap it for lavender or gray or a dull mauve so faded it feels like emotional beige. Not cheerful, just permissible. Because color is dangerous. It implies joy, and joy for a widow must be reintroduced like a bad habit. You send out calling cards now. White cards, black border, just so no one forgets. They are statements, really. Not "come visit," more like I am still here, and I can make tea if you promise not to be cheerful. You host a small tea, nothing extravagant. You polish the silver, line up the shortbread biscuits, and place the violets in a vase that used to hold condolence roses. No one comes. Well, someone sends their regrets. Someone else sends their maid with a handwritten note. And one lady, you later learn, stopped outside the gate, stared at your window, and walked on. Because even in half mourning, you are still a complication. Too merry, and you're indecent. Too sad, and you're a bore. Too present, and you're taking up space someone else thinks they deserve. But you persist. You walk again. Modestly. Not for exercise, not for fun. Just to be seen, to remind society that you are progressing through your grief at the socially acceptable speed. Your head is down, your gloves are on, your face is neutral. You do not smile at strangers. You do not pause in front of shops with bright window displays. You do not, under any circumstance, hum. Inside, something stirs. Not happiness exactly, just curiosity. You notice the buds on the trees. You reread a novel you once enjoyed. You laugh, once, and then immediately look around to see if anyone noticed. Because even your recovery must be polite, restrained, sanctioned. Half mourning is a transition, but not a transformation. You are not expected to bloom. You are expected to fade less. Your wardrobe reflects this. No longer draped entirely in death, but still tethered to it. Gray silks instead of black bombazine, pale gloves, jewelry with fewer locks of hair and more dull pearls, mourning's favorite neutral. The veil shortens, the stairs last longer. You are now in the danger zone, no longer off limits, but not quite open for business. Men notice you again, carefully, curiously, some with pity, some with calculation, some with the quiet horror of realizing you are now what their wives might one day become. You, however, remain undecided. Part of you wants to lean into this freedom, however limited, to order brighter fabric, to stay out a bit longer, to finally eat a warm scone without wondering if it looks celebratory. But part of you hesitates, because grief is a strange shelter. It keeps people at a distance. It excuses silence. It explains your lack of enthusiasm for absolutely everything. Leaving it behind feels exposed. Still, half mourning moves forward like a river, slow, relentless. You can't stand still forever, or people will start whispering again. Different whispers this time. She's frozen. She never recovered. Maybe she was never quite right. So you host another tea. A few come. The conversation is stiff, but manageable. You ask after their children. They ask about your sewing. No one mentions your husband. This is how re-entry begins. Not with trumpets or sunshine, but with tepid tea, cautious smiles, and a half-hearted compliment on your tasteful use of gray. It's not freedom, not yet, but it's something. A slightly less suffocating dress, a slightly longer walk, a laugh you allow yourself without apology. You are half mourning, half present, half alive, and for now, that is enough. You would think widowhood might earn you a little dignity. After all, you've performed grief like a trained actress. You've survived the social minefield of mourning, mastered tea without smiling, and embroidered your soul into a sampler. But no. Somewhere along the way, your tragedy became funny. Because Victorian society, in all its lace-curtained brilliance, decided that widows are hilarious. Not the good kind of hilarious. Not witty or clever. But desperate, thirsty. A punchline in a crinoline. You first notice it in the magazines, a cartoon maybe, A plump, middle-aged woman in all black fluttering her fan at some terrified bachelor. The caption reads something like, "One foot in the grave, the other at the altar. You are apparently a threat wrapped in lace." Then there are the plays, the operas, the serialized novels. You, dear widow, are now a trope, a recurring character in society's favorite comedy sketch. You're the woman who laughs too loud at dinner, who flirts too boldly during parlor games, who arrives fashionably late and leaves with someone's card tucked in her glove. Never mind that you haven't done any of those things. Never mind that your most scandalous act this month was buying lavender ribbon before noon. The image has already taken hold. You are a husband hunter. You are on the prowl. You are, in polite terms, forward. You had your chance, they say. You were married. You wore the white dress. You threw the bouquet. You stood beside a man and claimed a title. And now you're supposed to step aside. Don't remarry too soon. It's unseemly. But also, don't wait too long, or you'll become that sort of woman. Society doesn't want you to be happy. It wants you to be harmless. Which is why, curiously, you're still invited to dinner parties. Not as a guest of honor. Certainly not as a romantic prospect. You're invited because you're useful. You're the quiet one who fills the awkward silence. The dependable woman who keeps the teapot warm and the gossip flowing. The neutral figure who won't outshine the debutantes or compete with the host's wife. You're safe, as long as you behave. But make one wrong move. Smile too brightly. Mention your late husband's name with something bordering on fondness. Laugh at the wrong joke. And suddenly, you're that widow again, the one from the cartoons, a social warning sign in petticoats. Even the great Charles Dickens, that chronicler of English virtue and vice, couldn't resist. His widows are often absurd, foolish, grasping, or else so sanctified they might as well be mummified. There's no middle ground. You are either silly or sacred, grotesque or ghost-like. The idea that you might simply be a person, complex, grieving, funny, flawed, has no place in this drawing room farce. You see it everywhere, in advice columns, women's magazines, the cruel edge of a clergyman's sermon. The widow must remember her duty to modesty. Second marriages should not be pursued with unseemly haste. A merry widow is a moral contradiction. Translation: don't be a burden. Don't be too alive. Don't ruin the story we've already written for you. Even your wardrobe can't escape mockery. The progression from black to gray to mauve becomes, in society's eyes, a countdown clock to your next proposal. Each lavender hemline is a punchline. Each shortened veil a scandal. And yet somehow you are expected to smile through it, to serve the tea, to fold the napkins, to pretend that being the butt of the joke is a privilege. Because being laughed at means you're still visible. And for a Victorian widow, that's something. The real joke, of course, is this. They mock you for your freedom, but envy it too, because you've survived love and death and shame. And now you walk through their drawing rooms with the unsettling knowledge that you don't need anyone's approval to keep breathing. You are your own woman now, and that to them is both amusing and terrifying. So let them laugh. Let them titter behind their gloves and scribble caricatures in the society pages. You've been through worse. You are the comedic widow, the joke, the cautionary tale. But you're still standing, and deep down, you know, you're the only one in the room who sees the whole script. It starts with a folded note, not scented, not warm, just crisp and official. The ladies' auxiliary would be pleased to welcome your presence once more. You are being summoned, not with fanfare, not with delight, but with approval, which in Victorian society is the closest thing to resurrection. You're no longer in deep mourning, no longer suspiciously subdued. You've passed through lavender, survived the polite whispers, and now you are back, or at least back where they want you. Your first appearance is at the church committee, a room of women in bonnets who speak in charitable tones and passive-aggressive questions. You've been keeping busy, I hope? How lovely to see you. Have you considered leading the hymnal fundraising this year? You smile, nod, fold your hands just so. You are now a pillar of tasteful grief, a symbol of moral recovery, a woman who can arrange the flower rota without bursting into tears. It's not exciting, but it is respectable. And for a Victorian widow, respectability is your new currency. Next come the chaperone requests, young cousins, nieces, neighbor girls. They need you now, not for your wisdom, of course, but for your availability. You are unmarried. You are boring in the most flattering way. You are the perfect shield against impropriety. So you sit in corners at dances. You sip diluted punch. You offer stern glances when a gentleman's hand lingers too long on a silk glove. You are visible, but not threatening. Involved, but not too much. When they say, "We're so glad you're back," what they mean is, "We're so glad you're back to being useful." You are now part of the parish's living wallpaper. Essential, but never noticed. And when you aren't at church or squinting at wayward waltzes, you are ladling soup. Soup for the poor. Soup for the sick. Soup for the endless stream of parish souls who show up weekly for relief, spiritual or otherwise. You're not allowed to season it. That would be too expressive. You wear gray gloves, and you serve each bowl with a smile that stops just short of joy. Because charity is only pious when it's sufficiently bland. Every Wednesday you ladle and nod. Every Friday you help fold bandages or stitch shrouds. And every Sunday you return to the pew where you once sat next to a man whose name you now recite only in prayers and polite conversation. The priest nods approvingly. The matrons whisper that you've come back to yourself. No one asks how you feel about it, but you smile, because that's what you do now. And when you return home, you unpin your bonnet, loosen your stays, and stare at the wallpaper. You think about running away. You won't, of course. Victorian society has no real exit strategy for women like you. Not unless you want to be labeled peculiar or fallen, but still, you imagine it. You imagine boarding a train with no return address. You imagine sitting by the sea in a scandalous emerald dress, sipping brandy from a teacup just to confuse people. You imagine a world where you aren't expected to keep everyone else's virtue in line, but instead, you wake the next morning and go to church, because that's what good widows do. And you are a very good widow now. You've done the grief, done the silence, done the lavender gloves, and the embroidered Bible verses. Now you're expected to be gracefully useful until you disappear entirely. Sometimes you rebel in small ways. A brighter ribbon, an offhand comment that borders on wit, a second serving of pudding at the church picnic. These are your rebellions now, measured, private, edible. Because the real act of defiance would be saying, "No, I'm not back, I'm changed, and I don't want to chair the altar linen subcommittee." But that would be too loud, too rude, too honest. And honesty for widows is considered unseemly. So you go on. You chaperone, you serve, you pray. You do everything except what you want to do. Wear green, not olive, not gray green. Real green, vibrant, lush, inappropriate. The kind of green that says you're not just surviving, you're hoping, living, wanting. But green, is for springtime, and widowhood isn't. So for now, you remain in lavender, in charity, in the back row of society's choir, singing politely, praying dutifully, and dreaming still of running away. You pour the tea. You feed the cat. You water the ferns on the windowsill. You attend church. You mend gloves. You write thank you notes for casseroles you didn't eat and company you didn't invite. From the outside, it looks like contentment, recovery, a respectable return to form. But inside your mind wanders. It begins quietly, these little trespasses, a stray thought, a flicker of color behind the gray, a fragment of a dream that doesn't involve black veils or soup ladles. You imagine a cottage by the sea, small, wind-battered, no butler, no callers, no reputation to stitch into every curtain. You would wear loose dresses, open the windows and let in the wild air, eat jam straight from the jar, unchaperoned. And when the neighbors talk, which they always do, you would smile and say, I was perfectly mad once. It was delightful. But for now, you are here, not in Italy, not by the sea, but in your parlor, surrounded by commemorative porcelain and monogrammed linen. So, you write. Poetry, of all things. But not in a notebook. That would be too visible. No, you write in the margins of your Bible. Small lines, crooked rhymes, half prayers, half confessions. You choose Psalms for the spacing, Isaiah for the irony. One page reads, I am fearfully and wonderfully bored. Another, in looping cursive, resurrection is a state of mind. You never read them aloud. You never share them. But the act of writing feels like oxygen in a room that's been closed too long. And then there's embroidery, still expected, still ladylike, still safe, or so they think. Your stitches are perfect. Your patterns traditional, floral sprays, doves, tasteful scripture. But if someone were to look very closely at the napkins, they might spot a tiny skull tucked inside a rose, or a skeleton hand cradling a lily. Little acts of defiance wrapped in cotton thread. You embroider one napkin with the phrase, forgive us our daily nonsense. Another, do not resuscitate. You keep them folded, private, but you know they're there, your personal protest banner disguised as domestic virtue. And oh, the novels. You tell the librarian you're reading for the book club, which you are, technically. You do read Wives and Daughters. You do admire Miss Austen's restraint. But tucked inside the pages is something livelier, more daring, a French novel, translated but not tamed, or a story where the widow leaves town and opens a bookstore, or takes a lover, or buys a boat. You read them in the evenings when the house is quiet, the cat in your lap, a single candle flickering like a secret. You imagine being the woman in the story, unapologetic, unapologized for. No one would recognize you. And then, just as quickly, you return to the hearth, to the tea, to the real world, where every second chance is weighed against scandal and budget. But you still think of Italy, not because you've ever been, but because it's the opposite of this. It's sunlight and noise and bad behavior. It's warm olives and louder women. It's a place where no one expects you to apologize for still being alive. And even though you'll likely never go, because widows don't book passage without reason or male chaperone, you let yourself imagine. You imagine the dress you'd wear, the stories you'd tell, the accent you'd fake badly. You imagine being someone else, or more daringly, yourself, just unleashed. Of course, you never speak of any of this. To the world, you are the same reliable woman with the same tidy home and same predictable smile. But you know better. You know how often your thoughts betray you. When someone compliments your composure, you smile and think, "You should see my embroidery." When someone says he would be proud of how you've carried on, you think he'd be terrified. You still feed the cat, still write your notes, still attend the tea gatherings and funeral luncheons. But inside, you are dancing barefoot by the sea, wearing scandalous green, eating cake with your hands. You haven't abandoned grief, but you've stopped letting it dictate the wallpaper. And even if no one ever sees the skulls in your stitching, even if no one reads your crooked little poems, even if you never make it to Italy, you'll know. You dared to want, to imagine, to remember what it felt like to be more than proper. And in a world that insists on silence, even a whispered fantasy counts as rebellion. You no longer wake to grief. Not exactly. You wake to the sound of the kettle rattling, the cat pawing at the door, the small, ordinary demands of a day. The veil is gone. The wardrobe has lightened. The black has faded. Not because you stopped caring, but because fabric does that when you've worn it into the ground. There's still gray, lavender sometimes, but now, when you open your armoire, you don't have to choose between grief and obedience. You choose what's clean, what's warm, what won't catch on the furniture. You sit at the window in the same chair you once sobbed in. Now you sip your tea slowly. You let the sun touch your face like it used to before everything had to feel symbolic. You are no longer the woman they whispered about. The woman who cried at market. The woman who wore too much black for too long. The woman whose letters smelled like ink and loneliness. You are still here, not as a shadow, not as a relic of someone else's legacy, not as a scandal or a saint, just you. You've made it through grief, through silence, through the long ceremonial performance of it all. You've made it through tea parties that felt like interrogations and letters that asked too much in too few words. You've survived people calling you strong when you felt like stone. You've survived how brave when you wanted to scream. You've survived casseroles, condolences, and curtain calls. And you are, somehow, still slightly sarcastic. That's what they never expected. They expected you to fall apart, or fade away, or reinvent yourself into a palatable new version of womanhood. Quiet, grateful, remarried. But you didn't. You sat with the silence. You wore the veil. You did the things, slowly, stubbornly, that were required of you. But now, you are something else. Not exactly joyful, not reckless or wild, just steady. And that, in this world, is its own kind of scandal, because Victorian society loves a tragedy with a neat ending. A woman who mourns properly, then vanishes politely. But you refused both. You stayed. You outlived the expectations, the judgment, the well-meaning advice. You outlasted the dress codes, the dinner party invitations, the backhanded prayers for your peace. You outlived even the story they told about you. You did not remarry, not because you couldn't, but because you didn't want to start over just to prove you could still be chosen. You didn't run away to Italy, but you dreamed of it. And sometimes that was enough. You still embroider. But now, the skulls are bigger, the napkins less discreet. You still go to church, but only when the weather is nice. And only if they're singing something you don't hate. You take walks where no one expects you to. You smile when you want to. You laugh when you shouldn't. And best of all, when people ask how you're doing, You sometimes say, surprisingly undead. They don't always get it. That's fine. You have stopped existing for their understanding. You are no longer performing your grief for approval. You are living it. Or not. On your own terms. And that, dear listener, is a quiet kind of revolution. They thought they were giving you a role. They didn't expect you to write your own script. You didn't become a new woman. You became yourself, just more so. Not bitter, not broken, not still mourning, still learning, still laughing, still here. You are the widow who didn't vanish, didn't apologize, didn't fade into wallpaper or fold herself back into someone else's story. You are the survivor, and you did it all without scandal, without spectacle, and, most remarkably, without ever once poisoning the tea. So if you've made it this far, dear listener, congratulations. You've outlasted corsets, crepe, gossip, and grief. You've worn the veil, served the soup, answered the letters. You've stitched your sorrow into samplers, swallowed your anger with weak tea, and smiled at people who called it recovery. You've endured the silence, then the chatter, then the endless whispered expectations of what a widow should be, and still, you remained yourself. They never saw it coming. Now, let it all go. Let the rules fall away, the morning routines, the rigid posture, the lace gloves pulled tight around your wrists. Let the quiet house grow quieter. Let the velvet curtains settle in the breeze. Let the ghost of your grief tiptoe down the hall and fade into the floorboards. You've done enough. There is no one left to impress, no dinner party to attend, no tepid condolences to rehearse a smile for. There is just you. You, who outlived the performance. You, who whispered your poetry into the margins. You, who embroidered tiny skulls and thought about Italy when no one was looking. You, survivor. You, rebel. You, quietly undefeated. Sleep now. Spinster or not. Mourning or not. Let the house be still. Let the cat take the warm spot at your feet. Let the stairs creak once more, then hush themselves into memory. And if the world still wants you to perform tomorrow, you can nod politely, then do as you please. You've earned your rest. So exhale. Let the shadows soften. Let your breath slow. Let your bones forget the weight of etiquette. Close your eyes. No chaperones. No condolences. No corsets. Just sleep. Good night, widow. You made it.